you don't really strike me as a sort of character who would want to throw yourself into the limelight. How big a decision was it to have that film made about you through what was such a massive life event?
Oh, I spent a long time thinking about it and really asking myself, if you're going to do this, can you commit to the idea in a way that is going to make a good film? Because I think it did require, lots of access and things like, would the birth scene be included if things were to end up at that point? So I think that was a good process that I took myself through, of making sure I was comfortable with that before even talking to anyone else about it. And also, all the way through, I instigated the project, and we all came together to work on it with the understanding that there would be consent at every stage, not just a sort of consent at the beginning and then everyone's free to do what they want sort of thing. So I knew right up until the very end of what you see in the film that I could stop things at any moment, and that reassurance and that trust, the fact that I knew I could say that I could withdraw my consent at any moment, meant that I had the freedom to not do it, if you see what I mean.
How much of that decision then was about doing it for you, and sort of documenting your own process and dealing with your emotions in a way that you could talk about, and how much of it was about other people in the trans community and talking to them?
I would say none of it was for me. I didn't do this for me at all. I mean, I felt like I would be a good person to try to make a film like this because I'm trans, but I'm also a journalist. So I knew the right people to speak to sort of think about, putting a team together, finding a brilliant director to collaborate with, and that sort of thing, and also just making sure that at no point was this becoming a sort of sensationalized, simplified, typical trans story that you might have seen in the past, sort of thing. So I did think I had strengths, but no, I absolutely did this for other people like me who have probably been given the same misinformation that I was. I only found out that I had the option of starting my family in this way through chancing across a YouTube video of a trans man in America a few years ago documenting his pregnancy. I'd been told that I was going to be made infertile by starting hormone therapy. And I'm not sure why doctors tell us that. There's no evidence for it. I think it's a sort of, I can understand that it's an assumption, but if you're telling someone something that extreme and life-changing, you need to be able to back it up. Otherwise, don't say it. Or help people explore their options in a truthful and open way, in a way that's not bound by gender stereotypes, which I think often the conversations around this are, where it's just assumed that if you're transitioning, you're not going to want to have kids because men can't be nurturing or something. So yeah, I wanted to undo a lot of that.
How much of that then was part of the conversation when you first went to start testosterone therapy and you wanted to transition? Was the kind of the childbearing or having children? How much did that come into the conversation with the doctors at the time, and in what sort of context?
It's sort of touched upon very briefly, in that they might say to you that you need to consider freezing your gametes. I think most trans people are told that, but not given any support to explore how to do that, and certainly not given any hope that it's going to be funded by the NHS. We don't have access to that sort of support on the NHS, although hopefully that might change in the future. I know people are working a lot behind the scenes to try and make it so that we can access fertility services equally on the NHS. But that's it, really, because there's this idea that you either do it before you transition or that's it. So I remember signing a consent form to start testosterone and thinking, well, this is it, I just won't have biological kids and I'll figure out what to do in the future. And I was in my early 20s and I was desperate to transition, and it absolutely was the right thing for me to do. But I should never have been put in that position of having to think that I was signing away my fertility.
Did it feel like a big loss at the time?
I think I was just trying not to think about it because I knew I needed to start transitioning, and yeah, I mean, it's an impossible dilemma, but it felt like an either-or choice. So, I think something a lot of people probably don't realise is that in some countries around the world, trans people are obliged to undergo sterilisation in order to access transition. And Japan, for instance, is a place that does that. And up until recently, places in Europe as well, Sweden, for instance, would require you to be sterilised. This government in the UK has always prided itself on not requiring sterilisation because obviously it's an infringement of one's human rights. But by sort of paying such little attention to trans people's wishes to start families and have full lives, and not just the lives that they dictate through this kind of narrow sense of what it is to transition, it is de facto sterilisation. And I think actually if we keep being given this misinformation, even now that we know that it's not true and that there are further options, and it's very easy to support a trans person to go through pregnancy in the way I did, and I had a very positive experience, it's criminal. It just shouldn't be allowed to happen.
Did you find throughout the journey that there was sort of kickback from the medical profession, or?
No, I was, yeah, like I said, I think I was very lucky. I think it's that sort of postcode lottery idea. I encountered my midwife was wonderful. The sonographer who you see in the film was wonderful. Yeah, and that's not because I was being looked after by people who had lots of experience with trans and gender non-conforming people. They're just good people, you know. And actually, you know, when you get put in an unfamiliar situation, I think as a healthcare professional, how you react comes down to just kind of the person you are rather than your training. So, you know, it was hard to be confronted with lots of gendered forms and all that sort of thing the whole time, but actual people were really wonderful, and yeah, that gives me a lot of hope.
So how did people respond to you initially then when you said, you know, I'm thinking about having a child and I'm thinking about having it in this way?
You know, in terms of out in public and just strangers, and I didn't ever get sort of recognised as a trans man who was carrying his own baby, who was pregnant. It's amazing, actually, the kind of invisibility, which on the one hand was really hard and made experiencing pregnancy really hard because I was invisible and I was erased by the forms and the kind of gendering of it all, which is understandable but unfortunate and hopefully will change. But the invisibility out in the world was a kind of protection, and I think people just thought I was a man with a beer belly, and I was absolutely fine and happy for them to assume that. And so yeah, that was, I was more struggling sort of internally with the feeling of not being on testosterone, but yeah, I think people read gender extremely quickly, and I had my facial hair and I had a deep voice, and then people just sort of, they would never think, oh, that's a pregnant man. And it would be wonderful to think that maybe one day we would live in a society where I could be recognised for that and just go about my business without fearing for my safety, but that's not the world we live in right now, so I was quite grateful for that. For someone like me, transitioning unlocks a certain sort of comfort and settledness within yourself. It makes you feel whole. It allows you to get on with life and just, you know, live the life you want to live. Being off it was very, very difficult, but being pregnant wasn't so difficult. So it's an interesting dynamic. Being reminded of being pregnant with kicks and a bump and all that sort of stuff was quite useful, quite helpful, quite grounding, reminded me what I was doing and what my job was in that moment, and reminded me why I wasn't on testosterone, which was so hard, but, you know, worth it. So that's always something I'm keen for people to understand, I suppose, that it's sort of, I feel like what I'm able to do with the support of my friends and family and my doctors is a superpower, basically. And what makes it difficult is the sort of being invisible and worrying about being misunderstood and worrying about the hostility you might encounter. The experience itself needn't be difficult if you're just able to experience it for what it is.
Have you come across people who say, oh, he just wants to have his cake and eat it, and how have you responded to those people?
Yeah, I find that a really strange idea. I guess I would ask people to ask themselves whether they want kids, whether they want a family. Like, if they don't, fair enough. If they do, then maybe we're not that different. That's all it is.